Talking Transformation podcast, presented to you from the Western Cape pod bunker located here in the heart of Cape Town, South Africa. This pod is presented to provide a platform and a voice for built environment professionals and interest groups who are working towards transforming the places and spaces here in South Africa. It is dedicated to those individuals and community groups that are supporting both the formal and informal processes that are shaping our cities and our spaces. Today's Talking Transformation podcast guest is Lauren Royston, a seasoned champion of land use tenure rights and communities, presently a senior associate at the Socioeconomic Rights Institute, or also known as SERI. Lauren's a leading authority on domestic housing and planning issues with a strong emphasis on tenure security. Recently, she's done projects including the Global Land Tool Network on tenure security and the Continuum of Land Rights in Southern Africa. She's been active in a number of non-governmental organizations or NGOs and the public sector for many years, working across the continent, including Mozambique, Malawi, Angola, and South Africa. She's been directly involved in the anti-eviction legal action, working on behalf of legal teams that have assisted residents evicted or facing eviction from the Johannesburg inner city. And listeners may have come across the SERI team, that Socioeconomic Research Institute, in support of the Kennedy Road settlement community in the Dear Mandela documentary that was released in and around 2013. That documentary portrayed very much the complexities and the community dynamics and challenges faced by that informal settlement and the land movement that emerged to improve tenure arrangements and the living conditions in that particular informal settlement. It had a lasting impact on my own understanding of the issues and those challenges faced by communities living in informal settlements. And what SERI have done recently is they published a series of publications that examine these issues through 3 informal settlements in a lot more detail. And I'm absolutely delighted that Lauren was kind enough to share some of her time with us to discuss those 3 or 4 publications that they've pulled together on those informal settlements. And that's what you're going to hear from her today. I hope you enjoyed the episode, and please let us know what your thoughts are via the Twitter platform or through the voice message facility available via the Anchor podcast platform. Enjoy the episode. Apologies to the listeners. The first 5 minutes or so of the interview with Lauren, for some reason the sound from her side on the Skype is not as clear as we would have wanted it, so apologies. Bear with it for the first couple of minutes. You will find that the sound picks up, and the rest of the majority of the interview is very clear and audible. Enjoy. So Lauren, many thanks for joining us today. Congratulations to you and the SERI team for the report, and thanks for joining us this morning.
Happy to, it's a pleasure. Thanks for the invitation.
So what were the circumstances that inspired you and the team there at SERI to undertake the research?
Well, I think that the important point was there was a general policy issue, which was that we felt that there was a really good upgrading policy instrument, the upgrading of informal settlements program, in place, but that it was seldom being used. And when it was used, it was being applied in very much a kind of greenfield, vacant land kind of way. So we were concerned with how an alternative approach could work and what would inform an alternative approach to upgrading. And in that respect, we thought, well, we really need to start with what currently exists and how people are organizing life in informal settlements. That should be the starting point for this alternative logic that we were proposing needed to apply. Then there was a second important issue, which was the Malani case and the judgment. The Malani case is about an informal settlement called Slovo Park, that's just south of Johannesburg. And in that case, we had worked with that community for a number of years, and they had adopted a litigation strategy as an option of last resort because they had been living in Slovo Park for a long time, and they tracked 20 years of broken promises. All they wanted was an application to be submitted to the Provincial Department of Human Settlements in Gauteng, and that's what the court ordered. So that was the second major issue that gave impetus to the research.
I mean, you talk there of 2 decades, and some of these informal settlements around the country have been around for many, many years, and I think it's an important aspect that we'll consider there. It was interesting in looking at some of the research that you've gone and described sort of informality as not, just you go on. You suggest it's about off-register and social property arrangements. I mean, is that something that you'd like to just maybe expand on?
Yes. What we mean by off-register, this is a term that came out of a recent publication that I co-authored called Untitled. And in using the word off-register, we wanted to find a way to reference the ways that most people in South Africa access property. We estimate it's in the region of 60% in Untitled. And it's off-register because it's not, the relations to land, the tenure relations, are not registered in the deeds registry. So off-register is a term simply to capture that. There's a great variety of tenure arrangements, which we can perhaps talk a little bit more about when we discuss the tenure theme a bit later. But we were really just trying to find a way of identifying, because it's invisible, these relationships, these tenure relationships, the social form of property is invisible to official systems.
And yet, as you say, it's becoming an increasingly prevalent and widespread means of people gaining accommodation in our urban areas, but it's sort of 1 in 4, 1 in 5 of our residents seem to be accessing accommodation via these means right now.
Yes, it's really important numerically that we understand the process that underlies. It's often referred to invasions, but in fact it's land occupation in terms of the legal language, and the reasons for why people occupy land, and I think our research sheds some light on that.
Well, thanks for bringing us back to some of the the basics and the reasoning behind your research. Let's look at those 3 settlements across the country. I think you looked at the Northwest Province, KwaZulu-Natal, and Western Cape. Do you want to tell us a bit about the 3 settlements and some of the characteristics about those?
Yes, sure. So Ratanang is the name of the settlement in Klerksdorp, Matlasola in the Northwest Province. And it was formed a long time ago, in 1986.
That is a long time, yeah.
Yeah, and it was initially as a result of farm dwellers in the area who came to settle on what was essentially a small holding. But it grew significantly through an occupation that took place in 2012. And we worked in the settlement because Siri was approached by the committee that was operating there because they were threatened with an unlawful eviction. So that's Ratanang. And then Marikana in Philippi East in Cape Town. I think a lot of people know about Marikana because of its size.
Correct, yeah, big one.
Between April 2013 and August 2014, the settlement grew massively through an occupation. And when we did the research, we estimated that about 60,000 people were living there in about 12,000 households. So it's enormous, the size of a small town.
Absolutely.
And I think the importance of it is it raises the question, aside from the people living there, it raises a much bigger question, which is, what do you do when you can't relocate? Relocate is meant to be an option of last resort in terms of the UISP. But Marikana throws up those sorts of questions as well. Because of the court case, it also identifies the issue of expropriation, because resolving the underlying land in all 3 settlements is really important, privately owned. And then the final one is Sianda in eThekwini. Sianda is the oldest settlement. It was initially occupied in around 1985, very particular origins. Along party political lines at the time. And then one of the major issues in Sianda, which really shaped people's experiences, was the road construction, which occurred in the mid-2000s, which led to relocation and displacement. But a lot of people were left behind. So our research, and that's the term they use, our research was with about 13,000 people that currently occupy the settlement.
Which is quite interesting because you've almost got a sliding scale in terms of those numbers, and between the three, if I look at that, you've got Ratanang there in the northwest province, plus minus 1,300 people or so. Then Sianda, if I understood correctly, as you say, about 13,500, and then Marikana at as the largest of the three at about 60,000. So three quite different in terms of scale, but the commonality for two of them being that we're talking decades. Decades that they've been in place, correct?
That's right. Long time. And what we identified was what people had done to bring order and dignity to their lives over a long period of time. And even in Marikana, relatively short, how people had organized their lives.
So, Lauren, I mean, how would we characterize life in these three settlements, and sort of what was common and what was perhaps unique to each of the three?
Okay, well, when we got to the end of the research process, excuse me, we identified the need to do a synthesis report, which was really to look across the specifics of the three sites and to try and identify how we could characterize life, because the series is called Norms, Practices and Agency. So we wanted to be able to say something more general. So one thing that we can say is that people exercise considerable agency in all three settlements. But the context was really important, because in all three settlements we also identified contestation. Contestation was a really important finding, and I think that it's really important to reflect on, because contestation occurred at a number of different levels. It occurred between councillors and occupiers. It occurred internal to settlements around various things such as leadership. It occurred between, in some places like in Marikana, between the existing residents or occupiers and their neighbours. It occurred on even a grander scale, such as the way that to some extent the Sianda as well, but particularly in Ratanang and Marikana, there was contestation between the right to housing and the right to property in the litigation process.
Right.
So contestation is really important, and it affected people's daily lives. And by the end of the research process, we really identified in our discussions with residents that it was a very heavy burden. So as much as there was agency, we also had to look, an organisation, we also had to look at the contestation that affected people's lives. We also identified that they were not informal places to live, because people organised themselves individually and collectively to secure access to land, because the market, the economy, the state were failing. They organised their residential and economic land uses. They self-provisioned access to the most rudimentary services. They imposed order on an environment that existed without formal recognition. So I think that this was really important. And the other aspect of organisation was the way that people organised to defend themselves against eviction, often brutal eviction and often on multiple occasions.
I mean, reading the reports, and the reports do make for very interesting reading. They're very clear and an easy read, if you like, even though the content and so forth at times is quite overwhelming and at times depressing. The thought that things have not changed for so many years, and as you say, people's ability and communities' ability to come together and actually make the difference, in spite of the best efforts or varying degrees of efforts by the municipality, I think it comes through very clearly in there. There are four key themes that you considered in turn and are common throughout all the reports. You talked about tenure security, access to basic services, economic life, and political space. Maybe we can just take a few minutes to consider each of these in turn.
Sure. So in the tenure security theme, we were interested in how people were securing access to land in the absence of legally secured tenure, and what they were doing in the face of eviction or threats of eviction. And in our conclusions, comparing the three sites, what we identify is that people developed local norms or local rules to organize their access to land and the way that they held land, and in some cases the way that they transferred land.
Right.
So enumeration was one of the most significant land management practices in the settlement. So we look at that across the sites. The other important conclusion that I think is necessary to highlight is that we came up with you working from the idea that tenure is not just about legal form, because that's often what we think tenure is.
Sure.
It's about whether people have ownership or whether they're renting and what are the legal forms. We really adopted a different approach, which was to identify locally how tenure worked. So we came up with three distinct categories of tenure that were in operation. The first one was the local tenure arrangements, which were largely socially configured.
Right.
We also identified statutory protective tenure, which in this case, in the case of urban settlements generally, is about Section 26 of the Constitution and the PI Act, which protects people against unlawful eviction and requires that if people would be rendered homeless, that alternative accommodation should be provided.
It's made available. Yeah.
So people have protection. They need to go to court to claim it if their rights are violated in any way. But those protective statutory rights exist for unlawful occupiers, and that's the important point.
Understood.
And then the third category was registered tenure title, which is what characterized the underlying land. And what we're saying is that these three different types of tenure, these different tenure arrangements coexisted on the sites that we explored and that we researched and observed. So I think this is really important for upgrading, because it means that an intervention needs to begin with an understanding that tenure arrangements are already in place. So I think that's the significance of that finding and a suggestion about what the policy implications might be. So coexistence is important.
Well, I thought it was interesting. The one sort of takeaway quote I have from the report there on tenure security is, quote, understanding the diversity of tenure arrangements, including the way in which the local tenures work in a settlement, is an essential starting point for informal settlement upgrading. So I think you've made the point very well there.
Thank
I
you.
mean, in terms of access to basic services, the next theme.
So what we did was we had a look at how people were surviving in terms of access to, particularly to water and sanitation and energy. But we looked at waste removal and policing. And we found that people, for example, there was a typology of responses by municipalities with no provision. I mean, I can say no provision in Ratanang. There was a water tanker that occasionally, in a fairly unreliable way, came to the settlement. And that was off the back of some promises made during local government elections. But what people were able to do, and it was central to the story at Ratanang, was there was a borehole pump immediately adjacent to the settlement, which people used to access water. They self-dug pit latrines, and there was also in all three settlements open defecation in surrounding fields when it came to sanitation. So we were really concerned to identify that there were massive personal and environmental and public health consequences to the lack of provision. And then in Marikana, what was really interesting was that the municipality had made an intervention in the provision of a very limited number of chemical toilets. And their location was really important. Because they were located along major access routes, they offered no privacy to people. So people also continued to self-provide. And then in Sianda, people had access to water and sanitation through communal ablution facilities, which was an initiative of the eThekwini municipality that they rolled out in informal settlements, and Sianda was one of those. And our research identifies how people experience those. So it was difficult in terms of accessibility. The further you, and it's also there's slope. It's quite a hilly area. So so people experience these in quite different ways. And we identified that one of the critical issues is that municipalities don't want to provide interim basic services until they're secure until they know what the future of the settlement is. But we really identify the need for these services, and that they need to provide at least a basic level of water and sanitation services to everyone living in their jurisdiction. Even if people are going to be relocated, there needs to be emergency basic service provision. So yeah, I think that the disproportional impact on women, children, and people with disabilities was important to note. And we really, later on in the report, we identify that access to basic services is the minimal intervention and an urgent priority for people living in all three settlements.
Well, I mean, I think that makes complete sense. The one thing that I found quite interesting was, if I understood correctly, in Ratnang, the sort of the focal point that standpipe became for the community, very much a sort of central point in terms of the infrastructure as well as a sort of gathering space. Did I understand that correctly?
That's right, because people would queue. It would depend on the pressure. So people would queue at the pump, and it became a social space. It was also, because it was an open space, there was some shade close by because there was a small plantation of blue gum trees. So people would gather there also for community meetings. So it performed an important social and community function as well.
Fascinating. If we move on to the economic life, that theme that you looked at?
What we identified with economic life, we were interested in how people were surviving, how were they getting by, and the one finding was that social grants and remittances were critical to how people were surviving, and that these social grants were a form of distributive income, and people were using them in innovative ways. So it wasn't, we tried to overturn that image of dependent people waiting for a state handout, because people were using these social grants and remittances really to survive. We also looked at the sort of standout economic activities, which in particular we looked at spaza shops, and we looked at the factors that made spaza shops sustainable. And in most cases, people were really just getting by, because making a profit depended on your location, how accessible you were to wholesalers, the cost of transport to get your goods to and from wholesalers, and it also depended on who your clientele was. So that was where location came in, because where there was a lot of footfall, spaza shops were doing quite well. But where they were relatively isolated inside a settlement, it was a little more difficult. Marikana was very interesting in this respect and important for policy implications because of its location close to wholesalers and because of its size. There was some differentiation in how people were making a living in Marikana. And there were people who had a relatively stable income, and this was because they were able to access the wholesalers close by, because they were located along Protea Road, where there was a lot of pedestrian traffic, and also because they had some important factors also in Sianda, like having access to savings, or having an initial capital injection was really important in Sianda and in Marikana. Another factor in Marikana was that people were able to employ others and expand their businesses. And so this made for relative economic stability. Having said that, though, in Marikana there were a lot of spaza shops that weren't in such a stable condition. So the differentiation is important, but it speaks to conditions around relocation, ability to save, and so forth. So I think those are really important findings. Another really significant issue that came up was about the relationship between our themes that we used to conduct the research. So economic life was very dependent on access to basic services. So if you
Right.
had access to electricity, then you were able to have a fridge and keep your goods cold and keep them fresh.
The
If you
basics,
didn't,
right?
the basics. It's really, it's kind of common sense. So I think that's really important, the link between access to basic services and making a living.
What is really interesting is the idea that whether we're talking about the formal or informal economy here, those issues of location come through very strongly. The whole question of how you have capital funding to get started, your startup costs and so forth. Each of those playing itself out in these three spaces.
Yes, exactly, and I think that in addition to that, or just building on that, the spatial land use implications are really important, because if you're looking, in situ upgrading of a place like Marikana is a daunting prospect, but there are clues. So, for example, Protea Road is, in the language of planners, is an obvious kind of activity route that would need to be reinforced by any formal planning intervention. So that the spatial issues, I think, are also really important.
Again, thanks, Lauren, for your reflection on that. And then the fourth and final theme that you looked at was around the political space.
Yeah, so we were interested, because of the rest of our work, in how people make use of opportunities for democratic expression. And so we adopted the idea of political space and tried to identify and characterize the different spaces that people were using as ways to advance their rights. And the first one that we identified was juridical, which refers to the courts. So and we saw this as a political space and as a form of democratic expression. So people were using the courts as a way of advancing their housing rights and protecting the gains that they'd made in accessing land. And the stories of the court processes are really important. So I'll take you briefly through what happened in each one. So in Ratanang, people employed the services of SERI and made use of the provisions in Section 26 around unlawful eviction and the PI Act to defend themselves against an unlawful eviction. So then what happened was that a steering committee was established in terms of the emergency housing program, in which the parties were to negotiate alternative land. And many of the residents would have preferred to stay and be upgraded in situ. So this was important because there was some mobilization around an alternative solution, which was to stay. And the way that played out spatially was really important, because Ratanang was in what was a former white group area. The alternative land that was identified was some distance away at a place called Alabama. It was just over 10 kilometers away, which in the context of the size of Klerksdorp was quite significant.
I was going to say, that's quite a significant dislocation, yeah?
It was, yeah. And it was more or less across the road from Jubiton, which is the old sort of group areas, Black Township, that served Klerksdorp and the surrounding economy. And Alabama was a relatively new development. The site that was identified was an extension of Alabama. Processes at the steering committee were important, not just from the juridical political space perspective, but also for what happened around. This was a formal platform of engagement with the municipality, which was not achieved or not achieved in a sustained way in any of the other sites. So I think really important case to look at. But it was plagued by things like irregular attendance at meetings that were not called on a regular basis, so momentum was lost, contestation over who represented who, contestation over participation of the residents at the existing development in Alabama, and so it went on. So eventually the steering committee actually collapsed, and people, after the research was completed, there was a site identified, but people another community occupied that land. And so the latest that I have heard about Ratanang is that people really got fed up with what was happening. They were living without services for so long. There was no provision of basic emergency services while the negotiations were underway, which was one of their requests. So what they did in the end was leave Ratanang and occupy a site close to Alabama, one of the other sites. So that tells a particular story, that they weren't evicted, so their housing rights, or unlawfully evicted, their housing rights were protected, but the formal process was not actually able to deliver in the end. In Marikana, the issue was also about relocation, and what we identified was, and when initially the LRC and then later SERI became involved, was brutal demolition of people's property, the anti-land invasion unit being deployed by the municipality, by the city of Cape Town, and then taking the city, taking the case to court. And then it was a question of the private owners who owned the underlying land, and there were several of those. So eventually the cases were joined. And what the court ordered was that the parties again go and negotiate to reach a solution. And should negotiation fail, the High Court ordered that expropriation would need to take place in order to secure the underlying land, which was really the first step in the upgrading process. And there was recognition that a settlement this size could not be relocated. In Sianda, the story is a little different, because Sianda itself, because of the construction of the freeway, people were relocated because they had to make space for that freeway, because they had occupied the road reserve. Some people had, some households were on the road reserve. So people were relocated to formal RDP housing projects, like a settlement called Kulula, and one of the sections of Sianda was upgraded in situ. So the people, that was called Section A, and it became known as Sianda Interface. Then there were two other parts of Sianda, which were called Sianda B and C, which were not upgraded. And people were still, when we did the research, waiting for some kind of resolution of an in situ upgrading approach. The litigation came in relation to a group of occupiers who were relocated on a temporary basis to a transit camp in Richmond Farm. It was meant to be for a short period of time, a few months, but years later they were still at Richmond Farm. And so the issue there was, the litigation there was about compelling the municipality to relocate them to somewhere permanent, which duly happened to Cornubia. So there were important lessons from the litigation in all of those three cases. The other political space was a local or settlement space, which really describes the mobilization and organization internal to the communities. There was some kind of committee in all of them, with changes over time. So Sianda was very, very important, because we were able to track over a period of time what informed leadership and committee structures in Sianda. And initially it was very politicized, because it was an Inkatha Freedom Party led occupation, and people needed to affiliate with the IFP. It was about 1986, in the late 80s, in order to occupy. And people did, because they needed access to land. Some people really did, but other people concealed other affiliations in order to maintain a foothold in the settlement. And then there was a process of change and a sort of promise of democracy in the early period of our democracy. And so a leadership changed, and it was elected and nominated in mass meetings, so in a more open, transparent and democratic way than had been the case previously. And then most recently, affiliation firstly with FEDUP and then with Abahlali, which is the current status, and the committee is presently a local branch of Abahlali. So that's a really important process to track, I think, for how it reveals what people do to organize internally, but also to seek affiliation and association that will improve their chances of visibility and representation, and also access to services. In Marikana, people organized in different parts of Marikana and in sections. or blocks, and that organisation was also reflected spatially in how the settlement was managed. And that was the case in all of the settlements. There was a kind of political mobilisation locally, but it had a spatial component that was reflected in how representation worked locally in the settlements, and offers a spatial dimension to how upgrading could occur. One of the most important findings in political space was that people were not struggling and organising for access to land and basic services. Their struggle was as much about material gains as it was about something non-material but equally important to the people we spoke to, which was a sense of belonging and recognition that we are here, we belong here, this is our place. So that was very much what informed political space in all three settlements. And then engagement with the municipality and with formal channels like ward committees and ward structures. People used those channels to the extent that they could and that they were useful. They didn't shut them off, and they made every effort they could to engage with the municipality, either through the ward structures or directly with officials. So that's the kind of story of political space. Different forms, different mechanisms, protest, stakeholder forums, ward committee participation, and the importance of belonging and recognition as much as technical, material benefits.
I mean, I think in going into that space, you've very clearly identified some of the challenges, the complexities, the personalities, the political affiliations, that whole question of identity, neighborhood formation. I mean, yeah, it's very clear. It's a massive challenge.
It is a massive challenge, and we're upgrading to come. Upgrading interventions themselves have an impact on those processes and on political space in the settlement. So I think that's really important. And I think a lot of officials know this, but it is complex terrain. But I think that the participative process envisaged in the informal settlement upgrading process does offer a framework within which to operate. We think it's a mistake to assume that you need to set up a new formation. You really need to understand what the existing dynamics are if you're going to have any kind of cohesive and representative process. And these are not straightforward processes.
Sure.
But what we've learned from Slovo Park, which was the Milani case I mentioned earlier, in the way that they've organized, is that if there are contestations, and there are around leadership, because as soon as there's the prospect of something happening, whether it's litigation, electrification, as was the case in Slovo Park, you do find that there are other interests that emerge. They may have been there all along, but suddenly they become more visible. And it's really important for the leadership, as we've learned from Slovo Park, to put that to the community, to test their representation, to make it an open process, to have the municipality there as an observer. So I think there are ways of dealing with it, but it does require strong local organisation.
Lauren, just before you start moving in towards some of the thinking around the recommendations that are going to inform your policy briefs that will follow the publication of these 4 reports, do you want to just touch on one element around the concept in the participation space of invited versus invented spaces? I found that a very interesting concept there.
Okay, so I mean, as you know, this is not our concept. And I know that a lot of NGOs have used it as a way of reflecting on how people they're working with, the structures they're working with, are engaging with the state. So really, it was a way of characterizing different kinds of engagement. And it's because informal settlements are often excluded from formal channels of participation, the invited spaces. Having said that, there is exclusion that takes place. But the ward committee participation as a formal means of engaging the state was in existence in all 3 settlements. So that was never abandoned. It was more a case of also using other channels to engage the state outside of official avenues. And these are called invented spaces. So protest is one of those, as an example. Right. But then what was interesting in Ratanang was that the steering committee was in some respects both, because it was invented to the extent that it came out of the actions that the residents had taken themselves to protect their occupation against unlawful eviction. But it was an invited space in the sense that it was in the boardroom of the municipality. So that makes for quite an interesting reflection, I think.
No, again, thanks for indulging me in that. As I found it quite an interesting take-home point. So if we move towards the genesis of your policy framework recommendations, and as I say, that which will ultimately be turned into some policy briefs by SERI, maybe some reflections on that from your side.
What we identified as the starting point, unsurprisingly, I suspect, because of our emphasis on understanding existing practices, our first conclusion in this phase of research is about recognition. So it's recognizing the existing norms and practices, whether it's around organization, whether it's around tenure, security, or whether it's around access to services and economic life. So understand, for example, the multiple existing tenure arrangements in a settlement as a starting point, which we mentioned earlier. Identify the clue, we make some practical application of this. I think recognition is a principle, and then we apply it in some practical ways. One of those practical ways is identify the clues offered by local land use management practices. So, for example, we look at how in all three settlements there's an open space or a social or community, maybe even institutional kind of land use to try and look for the language of the official system. And that offers clues because of where it's located and how people use it, of something that should be retained. Similarly with major access routes, whether they're roads or pathways or blocks that people have identified and organized themselves in. These all offer clues for local land use management practices. Also, where the location of economic activity is, I think, is very important, and I mentioned that in my comment.
Absolutely.
And then another example of applying the recognition principle would be to look at, we came up with a typology of municipal responses to service provision. So we looked at what currently exists, and we came up with a kind of continuum of a very, very little provision through to interim services. So I think that what we've tried to say is that this is a starting point, and we'll build in all four themes, we'll build on these to take them forward in our policy briefs, which will focus generally on informal settlement upgrading, but specifically on these different themes using our preliminary directions as a starting point. So then we also looked at what people are prioritizing themselves. And aside from securing their residential status, which basically is about, refers to tenure security, it refers to recognition that we are here to stay, which is what we titled the final report. I think that people were very clear. So the residential status in its most fundamental form is security against eviction. But obviously that needs to be built upon in terms of recognition of occupation. And one of the recommendations we make is about land records. So enumeration is really important because it produces evidence, and this is what makes people feel more secure. So build on that. Start looking at how these occupation rights can be recorded. Then the other priority is the provision of basic services. And I think I've spoken to the health, environmental, and other issues already. And that is also linked to, that's about improving quality of life, opening up opportunities for making a living. But then the other priority is improved policing. And that's really important for people's sense of security. So effective, visible policing was another really important priority. So those are, in essence, the three most important priorities. Safety in terms of policing, basic services, and tenure security. But then we also identified what I mentioned earlier, which is about attending to non-material needs, questions of recognition and of belonging. And I think there's two important points to make in this regard. I think we can see in this finding across the sites some direction for an urban land reform program, because I think urban land reform brings with it the prospect of recognizing the history of dispossession, recognizing why occupations take place to begin with, and providing a recognition and dignity to people through sort of the land question. The other aspect of how to deal with the importance of non-material needs and belonging is about process. It's about how people are engaged with, how participative processes take place. And this was another really important finding in political space, is that it's very important to build relationships, and it's a social sort of process finding, but it cannot be underestimated in terms of what we found in all three settlements. It's about building relationships, it's about setting up processes that deal with people with dignity, and this was absent in all three cases. And that brings me to one of the final findings, which is build constructive relationships with residents, because the state isn't absent. In none of these settlements is the state absent.
That comes through very clearly.
Yeah. So I think in summary, those are the main directions that we offer for policy and implementation. And as I said, and as you've mentioned, thank you, we'll be taking this up in a future, well, in the next phase of work when we develop a series of policy briefs.
Well, Lauren, I mean, I think that's a very comprehensive reflection on the work that you've done. My question would really be where to next? Who are you going to be targeting in terms of the papers? Are you going to be hitting the National Department of Human Settlements? Is it more of a question with taking it to the provincial or municipal level and the communities across the country? What's your thought about where to next in terms of getting the message out there and using your advocacy and agency to influence the position going forward?
Well, the first thing is making the findings public through launch and dissemination of the reports and the main findings. There are paper copies available, but they're all available in PDF format on our website. And so we had a launch in Johannesburg. We went to Cape Town, to Khayelitsha, where we launched the research as a whole, but we focused on Marikana in particular. And we'll do a launch, I think it's going to be on the 6th of September, I'm not sure, but we're going to do, I can't quite recall, sorry, but there's a late August or an early September launch in eThekwini in Sianda. So the starting point really is to go back to the communities. We obviously engaged very closely with them, did verification and so forth. But I think what's very important is that in the, for example, in the Marikana launch, we also attached a second day to the launch, which was a community exchange. So several informal settlement communities in Khayelitsha and Marikana and Slovo Park from Gauteng spent a day together looking at strategies, how they can learn from each other and what they can do. And so that's important. In Durban, we will be partnering with Abahlali, which was the organization we partnered with in undertaking the research. The Abahlali field workers were with us in the research process in Sianda. And that's another important process, because we hope that it will strengthen Abahlali in their engagement with the state around informal settlement upgrading. So in overview, the first response is that it's the community advocacy that I think is an important starting point. But then there's also policy advocacy. So in respect of policy advocacy, we have in the Johannesburg launch, we had a number of Johannesburg officials attend the launch, national officials, provincial officials. So that's a starting point. Great stuff. What we plan to do is to use the process of developing the policy briefs to work with policymakers and decision makers prior to and in the process of developing the policy briefs. So I think that's a very important part of the how question and what next question.
So I think you've made the point that the reports are available on the website, and we'll make sure that there are links through our Twitter feed and through the Talking Transformation podcast platforms. So we'll do our best to try and get it out from our side. Where can listeners find out more over and above the website and from Seri's side, Lauren?
Well, they can contact Seri directly. You'll find our email addresses on the website, and we're very happy to engage with people who want to find out more about the research and the implications. So yes, please do that. And Peter, thank you for the opportunity. I think it's a really important platform And we do hope that it generates some interest, some feedback, and some further engagement, because that would be very much part of our advocacy strategy. So this is an important space for us, and we hope that we can continue communicating with people about the research as a result of this. So thank you very much.
No, thank you to you, Lauren, for giving your time on an early Monday morning to spend some time with us, explain the amazing work that you've done. We really do wish you the very best with it. Regards to all of you and the team up there in Johannesburg, and good luck. We look forward to hearing more from Seri in the future with the work that you're doing and the communities that you're trying to support and advance. All the very best, Lauren. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Peter.
Get involved, get informed, most importantly, get subscribed. You can find us on our Twitter feed at Talking Transfo and the number 1. That's Talking Transfo 1. Talking Transformations music kindly supplied by Tribal Need. Find them at tribalneed.com.